Billy Cooper's weathered hands stopped mid-reach for the kennel latch, his breath catching in his throat like a man who'd just seen a ghost. The silence that followed wasn't the peaceful quiet of dawn. It was the suffocating stillness that comes before something breaks forever. What lay crumpled in that medical waste container wasn't disposal paperwork or broken equipment. It was a German shepherd puppy, barely breathing, with a red, failed tag tied around his neck like a death sentence. Dr. Sarah Mitchell's clipboard clattered to the concrete floor, her gasp echoing through the empty facility. The overnight security guard stumbled backward, his flashlight beam trembling across the scene. Even the seasoned veterinarian who'd seen 40 years of animal suffering pressed her hand to her mouth in disbelief. Billy's mind flashed to Betty's funeral, that same helpless weight in his chest, that same moment when the world tilted wrong. But this time this small life was still fighting. "Dear God," Billy whispered, his voice cracking like old leather. His arthritic fingers moved toward the dying puppy with surgical precision. Who throws away a perfectly healthy animal? And why was someone so desperate to hide it? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Frank William Cooper, Billy to everyone who mattered, had buried enough dreams to fill the Bourne Cemetery twice over. At 67, his hands told the story of a life lived hard. 43 years carrying a badge, 35 of those with a German shepherd at his side, and 3 long years learning how to wake up alone. The ranch house sat like a monument to better times, 12 acres of Texas hill country that his grandfather had carved from stubborn soil and sheer will. Betty's coffee mug still claimed its place on the kitchen counter, a daily reminder that some habits die harder than hope. Her reading glasses remained folded on the nightstand, marking page 247 of a romance novel she'd never finish. Michael's flag sat perfectly folded on the mantel, triangle sharp and dust-free, because a mother's love doesn't end with a soldier's last breath. Billy poured 2 cups of coffee every morning, catching himself before the second one cooled untouched. 3 years, and his muscle memory still believed Betty might shuffle into the kitchen, humming hymns and stealing sips from his cup while planning her day around other people's needs. The silence had weight now, pressing against his chest like the arthritis in his knuckles, constant, aching, impossible to ignore. The pension barely stretched to cover property taxes and Betty's lingering medical bills. $847 in checking, $220 in savings, and a mortgage application that banks looked at like a joke nobody found funny. Too old for new debt, they said, as if 67 meant he'd already picked out his headstone. Kendall County Sheriff's Department had been his whole world until the day they handed him a gold watch and told him to enjoy retirement. 43 years of partnership with 12 different K-9s, each one teaching him something new about loyalty, courage, and the kind of love that doesn't ask questions. Rex had been his last, a black German shepherd with eyes like midnight and a heart bigger than Texas. When Betty died, Rex seemed to understand that grief was a shared burden. When Rex followed her 6 months later, Billy finally understood what people meant when they said a man could die of loneliness. The old dog run sat empty behind the house, chain-link fencing and wooden shelter weathered gray by seasons of neglect. Betty's garden had surrendered to Johnson grass and wild flowers, nature reclaiming what love could no longer tend. Some evenings, Billy would stand at the kitchen window, watching shadows move across land that had once hummed with purpose, wondering if God was testing his faith, or if he'd simply been forgotten in the vast calculus of divine attention. "Betty always said you were too stubborn for your own good," he'd tell the empty air, his voice carrying the weight of conversations that would never come. But stubbornness had kept him breathing when grief tried to stop his heart, and stubbornness had led him to that kennel facility at dawn, searching for something he couldn't name but desperately needed to find. The puppy's breathing came in shallow gasps that reminded Billy of Michael's last phone call from Kandahar. Broken, struggling, fighting for every second. Justice couldn't have weighed more than 20 pounds, his black coat matted with something Billy didn't want to identify. The red "failed" tag hung from his neck like a scarlet letter, damning him for crimes he was too young to understand. Billy's hands moved with the practiced efficiency of 4 decades in emergency situations. Strip off his flannel shirt, wrap the shivering body, generate warmth. Check for obvious injuries. Cracked ribs, shallow cuts, the telltale puncture marks of injection sites that made his stomach clench. The puppy's eyes fluttered open, dark brown, and filled with a resignation that no animal should ever carry. "Easy, boy," Billy whispered, his voice rougher than sandpaper. "We're gonna get you some help." The drive to doctor. Sarah Mitchell's emergency clinic felt like the longest 15 minutes of Billy's life. Justice lay motionless in the passenger seat, wrapped in flannel that smelled like Old Spice and regret. Every red light was a countdown, every mile a gamble against time that Billy couldn't afford to lose. Dr. Mitchell had delivered calves in midnight thunderstorms and stitched up ranch dogs torn by coyotes, but the look on her face when she examined Justice told Billy everything he needed to know. This wasn't neglect, this was something darker. "Billy, this puppy's been systematically abused," she said, her hands gentle as she palpated his ribs. "These injection sites suggest heavy sedation, probably for weeks. The malnutrition is severe, and there's internal bruising consistent with repeated trauma." The estimate hit Billy like a physical blow: $3,500 for surgery, $500 for medications, ongoing care that could stretch for months. Billy stared at the numbers, calculating against a bank balance that wouldn't buy decent groceries for a week. "Doc, what happens if we don't do the surgery?" Sarah's eyes held the kind of compassion that came from 20 years of impossible choices. "Billy, sometimes the kindest thing—" "No!" The word came out harder than Billy intended. "I've put down enough things in my life. This one fights." He thought about the ranch, about 37 years of mortgage payments, and the deed that represented 4 generations of Cooper's sweat. Betty would have sold her wedding ring for a stray cat. Hell, she probably would have sold the house. "I'll figure out the money," Billy said, his voice carrying more conviction than his bank account could support. Justice's file appeared like evidence in a crime scene. Thick, official, stamped with the kind of bureaucratic finality that ended conversations. "Aggressive tendencies, unsuitable for service," was typed across the top in red letters that might as well have been a death sentence. Dr. Mitchell frowned as she read, her eyes moving between the paperwork and the trembling puppy on her examination table. "Billy, this dog isn't aggressive. He's terrified. There's a difference." Something cold settled in Billy's chest, the same instinct that had kept him alive through 4 decades of police work. Files could be altered, reports could be falsified, but the evidence was lying right in front of them, a scared, abused puppy whose only crime was being inconvenient to someone's agenda. "Doc, who signed off on this evaluation?" "Dr. Richard Hawthorne. He handles all the K9 program assessments." Billy knew Hawthorne by reputation, efficient, by the book, the kind of veterinarian who treated animals like inventory rather than individuals. But this felt like more than professional detachment. This felt like a cover-up. As Sarah prepped Justice for surgery, Billy stepped outside and called Rosa Martinez, widow of Deputy Miguel Martinez. Miguel had been killed 6 months ago in a drug raid. His K9 partner mysteriously retired immediately afterward. Rosa answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the careful wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust official explanations. "Billy, is everything okay?" Rosa, I need to ask you about Miguel's canine. What happened to Bruno after the raid? Silence stretched between them like a held breath. When Rosa finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Billy, Miguel was asking questions about the canine program before he died. Dogs that were supposed to be retired or euthanized, but he couldn't find any records. He thought someone was selling them. The pieces clicked together with the sickening certainty of a puzzle Billy didn't want to solve. Justice wasn't just a failed canine, he was evidence. Evidence that someone was willing to kill to protect. Billy looked through the clinic window at the small form on the surgery table, fighting for his life while machines beeped steadily in the background. This wasn't about saving one dog anymore. This was about justice for Miguel, for Bruno, for every animal that had disappeared into a system designed to protect them. Rosa, I'm going to need everything Miguel documented. Can you meet me tomorrow? Billy, be careful. Whatever Miguel found, it got him killed. Billy hung up and watched Justice's chest rise and fall with mechanical precision. Sometimes a man had to choose between being safe and being right. Billy had made that choice 43 years ago when he pinned on his first badge. He wasn't about to stop now. The knock on Billy's door came at exactly 7 a.m., 2 days after Justice's surgery. Through the peephole, Billy saw Margaret Maggie Stevens, flanked by a Kendall County deputy he didn't recognize, young, nervous, the kind who followed orders without asking questions that might complicate his pension. Maggie stood like a woman accustomed to getting her way, 52 years old with steel-gray hair pulled back in a bun that could have been regulation military. Her badge identified her as director of the regional K-9 training program, but her eyes held something Billy couldn't quite read, determination mixed with what looked suspiciously like guilt. Billy Cooper? Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent 20 years making decisions other people had to live with. I'm here about K9089, the animal you removed from our facility. Justice, Billy corrected, stepping onto his porch and closing the door behind him. No need for strangers to see into a man's private grief. His name is Justice. That animal is government property, Mr. Cooper. Removing him constitutes theft under federal law. Maggie's words came out rehearsed, like she'd practiced this conversation in her mirror. We're prepared to be reasonable given your years of service, but we need him returned within 48 hours. Billy felt the old familiar anger rise in his chest, the same fire that had sustained him through 4 decades of bureaucratic nonsense. Ma'am, with all due respect, that dog was in a medical waste container. Far as I could tell, y'all had already thrown him away. The young deputy shifted uncomfortably, his hand resting on his radio like he was expecting trouble. Maggie's jaw tightened, but something flickered behind her eyes. Surprise, maybe, or recognition that Billy wasn't going to fold like a cheap lawn chair. The animal failed his evaluation, Mr. Cooper. He showed aggressive tendencies that make him unsuitable for law enforcement work. Your protocol requires dumping live animals in trash containers? Billy's voice carried 43 years of authority, the kind that made rookies stand straighter and seasoned officers pay attention. Because that's where I found him, Director Stevens, dying in a pile of medical waste like yesterday's garbage. News traveled fast in Bourne, population 13,876 on a good day when the tourists weren't clogging Main Street. By noon, Billy's phone was ringing off the hook. Betty's old friends from First Baptist were organizing a bake sale. The Rotary Club was debating emergency funding. 3 different lawyers had left messages offering pro bono services, but the town was splitting like wood under a sharp axe. County Commissioner Drake Wilson held an impromptu press conference outside the courthouse, his red face sweating under television lights as he lectured about fiscal responsibility and the rule of law. Taxpayers fund these programs to the tune of $50,000 per animal, Wilson declared, his jowls quivering with righteous indignation. We cannot allow misguided sentiment to override professional judgment. Failed animals must be disposed of according to regulation. The word disposed hung in the air like a curse, and Billy felt something cold settle in his stomach. Not euthanized, not retired, disposed of, like justice was broken equipment instead of a living creature with thoughts and feelings and the capacity to love. Justice himself was recovering with the stubborn determination of something that had decided life was worth fighting for. The surgery had revealed internal bleeding from repeated trauma, malnutrition so severe it had stunted his growth, and enough sedative residue in his system to suggest months of chemical restraint. But his eyes were alert now, following Billy's movements with the focused attention of a creature learning to trust again. "He's not aggressive," Dr. Mitchell told Billy during their third post-operative visit. "Whatever they did to him, whatever they saw, it wasn't natural behavior. This dog has been systematically traumatized." Billy knelt beside the recovery kennel, extending his hand palm up the way he'd learned 40 years ago with his first canine partner. Justice approached cautiously, his nose twitching as he processed the scent of honest work and Old Spice aftershave. When the puppy's tongue touched Billy's fingers, warm, tentative, hopeful, something cracked open in Billy's chest that had been sealed shut since Betty's funeral. "That's a good boy," Billy whispered, his voice thick with emotions he thought he'd buried. "You're gonna be just fine." Rosa Martinez arrived that afternoon carrying a manila envelope that felt heavy with secrets. Miguel's widow was 34, pretty in the way of women who'd learned to carry sorrow like jewelry, visible but not overwhelming. Her husband's death had left her with 2 small children and a pension that barely covered rent in a town where housing costs climbed faster than wages. "Miguel kept everything," she said, settling onto Billy's porch swing with the envelope clutched against her chest. "Financial records, correspondence, photographs. He said if anything happened to him, I should find someone who could make sense of it all." The documents painted a picture uglier than Billy had imagined. 47 dogs marked as disposed over 3 years, but no corresponding veterinary records of euthanasia. Financial irregularities that suggested someone was billing for services never provided. Purchase orders for medical supplies that never appeared in inventory. Most damning was Miguel's handwritten note, dated 3 days before his death. "Bruno shows no signs of PTSD. Hawthorne's evaluation is fabricated. Someone is removing healthy animals from the program. Need to document everything before they realize I know." Billy looked up from the papers to find Rosa watching him with eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. Miguel was going to blow the whistle? He was scheduled to meet with Internal Affairs the Monday after he died. Rosa's voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she spoke. The raid that killed him wasn't supposed to be dangerous. Intelligence said the house was empty. The implications hit Billy like a physical blow. Miguel Martinez hadn't died in the line of duty. He'd been murdered to protect a secret that someone was willing to kill for. And justice, traumatized, abused, marked for disposal, was a witness to crimes that went far beyond animal cruelty. "Rosa, we need to take this to the FBI." Miguel tried that. They said it was a local matter, told him to work through proper channels. She laughed bitterly. Proper channels that included the people he was investigating. Billy studied the young woman sitting on his porch, Betty's old swing creaking gently in the afternoon breeze. Rosa Martinez was risking everything by sharing her husband's evidence, trusting a retired deputy she barely knew because she had nowhere else to turn. "Ma'am, I give you my word, we're going to get justice for Miguel, and for Bruno, and for every animal they've stolen or killed." Rosa nodded, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "Miguel always said you were one of the good ones, Billy. He said if anything happened, I should find Frank Cooper and tell him the truth." As Rosa drove away, Billy stood on his porch watching storm clouds gather over the Texas hills. 48 hours until Maggie Stevens returned with a court order. 48 hours to figure out how to protect justice and expose a conspiracy that had already claimed at least 2 lives. Inside the house, Justice was sleeping peacefully for the first time since Billy had found him, his breathing steady and strong. But outside, the wind was picking up, and Billy could smell rain coming. He'd weathered storms before, but this one felt different, bigger, more dangerous, and aimed directly at everything he had left to lose. Billy's investigation led him down rabbit holes that would have made Alice dizzy. Miguel's documentation revealed a pattern spanning 3 years. Healthy dogs entering the system, failing mysterious evaluations, then vanishing without proper disposal records. The financial trail was even more damning. $50,000 budgeted per canine, but actual training costs rarely exceeded $20,000. Someone was pocketing $30,000 per dog, multiplied by 47 animals. That someone, Billy was beginning to suspect, was Dr. Richard Hawthorne. Hawthorne ran his veterinary practice like a machine, efficient, profitable, and utterly without warmth. His clinic sat on the expensive side of town, all glass and steel architecture that screamed success to anyone driving past. But Miguel's notes suggested the good doctor had expensive habits that a veterinary salary couldn't support. Horse racing, high-stakes poker games, a lifestyle that required constant infusions of cash. Justice was healing faster than anyone expected, his natural resilience overcoming months of systematic abuse. The puppy followed Billy everywhere now, a black shadow with intelligent eyes that seemed to understand more than any 5-month-old dog should. When Billy worked in the barn, Justice lay nearby, watching. When Billy cooked his solitary dinners, Justice waited patiently for scraps that always came with gentle words. "You're not failed, boy," Billy would tell him during their evening walks around the property. "You're just different. Sometimes different is better." The town hall meeting on November 22nd packed the community center beyond capacity. Folding chairs filled every available space, with overflow crowds standing along the walls and spilling out the doors. The divide was clear. Betty's old church friends on one side, Commissioner Wilson's fiscal responsibility faction on the other, with undecided residents caught uncomfortably in between. Drake Wilson commanded the podium like a preacher delivering fire and brimstone, his red face gleaming under fluorescent lights as he lectured about taxpayer dollars and government accountability. "We cannot allow sentiment to override sound fiscal policy," he declared, his voice echoing off cinder-block walls. "These animals are trained for specific purposes. When they fail to meet standards, continuing to fund their care is a waste of public resources." Billy sat in the back with Justice at his feet, watching neighbors he'd known for decades choose sides in a battle that went deeper than one dog's fate. Mrs. Henderson from the grocery store nodded along with Wilson's speech. Tom Rodriguez, whose daughter Justice had helped find when she wandered off from the school playground, shook his head in disgust. "Furthermore," Wilson continued, "harboring government property constitutes theft, regardless of Mr. Cooper's previous service record. Law and order must be maintained especially when it's difficult." Sarah Chen, the young lawyer who'd driven down from Austin, stood to address the crowd, 28 years old with determination that reminded Billy of Betty at that age, fierce, uncompromising, absolutely certain that right would triumph over wrong. "Commissioner Wilson talks about law and order," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly to the back of the room. "But what about the law that requires proper disposal documentation? What about the order that demands accountability for public funds? Mr. Cooper didn't steal anything. He rescued evidence of systematic fraud." The crowd erupted in competing applause and boos, neighbors shouting at neighbors while Justice pressed closer to Billy's leg, overwhelmed by the human chaos swirling around them. Billy reached down to stroke the puppy's head, offering what comfort he could to a creature who'd already endured too much conflict. That's when Jake Cooper walked through the back door, 34 years old and wearing the same stubborn expression Billy saw in the mirror every morning. Billy's nephew hadn't set foot on the ranch since Betty's funeral, their relationship fractured by Jake's certainty that Billy was living in the past and Billy's conviction that Jake had forgotten where he came from. Jake's arrival changed the dynamic immediately. He was successful, polished, the kind of man people listened to when he spoke. His presence lent credibility to Billy's cause in ways that an old retired deputy couldn't achieve alone. "I've been listening to this debate for the past hour," Jake said, not bothering with the microphone as his voice filled the room. "And I keep hearing about fiscal responsibility and government property and legal technicalities, but nobody's talking about the real issue here." The room fell silent, even Wilson's supporters curious about what Jake Cooper had to say. Billy felt his heart hammering against his ribs, uncertain whether his nephew was there to support or undermine him. "My uncle has spent his entire adult life protecting this community. 43 years of putting himself between danger and the people he swore to serve. He's buried his wife, his son, and more canine partners than any man should have to. And now, when he tries to save one life, one small life that someone threw away like garbage, we're debating whether he's a criminal?" Jake's voice rose with each word, passion replacing the careful, corporate speaking style he'd cultivated in Dallas. "This isn't about money or regulations or government property. This is about who we are as a community. Are we the kind of people who turn our backs on the defenseless? Are we the kind of neighbors who let bureaucrats decide what lives have value?" The applause started slowly, scattered clapping from Betty's church friends that gradually spread throughout the room. Even some of Wilson's supporters found themselves nodding along, caught up in Jake's emotional appeal. Billy felt something loosen in his chest, a knot of tension he'd carried for 3 years beginning to unravel. After the meeting, Jake approached Billy's truck with the careful movements of a man crossing hostile territory. Justice wagged his tail. The puppy had always been a better judge of character than most humans, Billy knew. "Uncle Billy, we need to talk." They drove to the ranch in silence, 34 years of accumulated grievances hanging between them like humidity before a thunderstorm. Jake's wife, Sarah, was 8 months pregnant with their first child, and his construction business was struggling in the post-pandemic economy. Billy knew Jake had been hoping to inherit the ranch, to sell it and use the proceeds to stabilize his finances. "I came here to convince you to give up the dog," Jake admitted as they sat on the porch. Justice stretched out between their chairs like a bridge across troubled water. "Sarah and we're barely keeping our heads above water financially. When you called about mortgaging the ranch, I thought you'd lost your mind." Billy nodded, unsurprised. He'd suspected Jake's motives from the moment his nephew appeared at the town hall. Family dynamics rarely changed just because circumstances shifted. "But watching you in there tonight, seeing that dog look at you like you hung the moon?" Jake's voice trailed off, his hands clasped tightly between his knees. "I remembered something Mom used to say about you. She said you never learned how to quit on something that mattered." The silence stretched between them, comfortable for the first time in years. Justice dozed in the evening heat, his breathing steady and peaceful, living proof that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. "Jake, I know you need money. And I know this ranch represents security for your family." Billy's words came slowly, weighted with decades of responsibility and loss. "But I can't let them take justice. Not after what they've done. Not after what I've learned." "What have you learned, Uncle Billy?" Billy told him everything. Miguel's documentation, the financial irregularities, Hawthorne's gambling debts, the systematic disposal of healthy animals for profit. Jake listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each revelation. Jesus Christ, Billy. You're talking about conspiracy, fraud, maybe even murder. I'm talking about justice. For Miguel, for all those dogs, for every taxpayer who thought their money was protecting communities instead of lining someone's pockets. Jake stood abruptly, pacing to the porch railing where he stared out at land that had been in their family for 4 generations. When he turned back to Billy, his face held the same determined expression that had defined Cooper men since their great-grandfather first broke ground on this hill. "What do you need me to do?" The question hung in the air like a prayer answered, like grace offered when least expected but most needed. Billy looked at his nephew, really looked at him, and saw past the corporate polish to the boy who'd spent summers on this ranch, learning about responsibility and sacrifice from his grandfather and uncle. "I need you to help me prove that justice isn't the only victim here. And I need you to help me make sure this never happens again." Justice raised his head at the sound of their voices, tail thumping against the porch boards, as if he understood that something important had just shifted. In the distance, thunder rumbled across the Texas hills, promising rain to wash away the dust and heat of a long, difficult day. For the first time in 3 years, Billy Cooper wasn't facing the storm alone. The confrontation Billy had been dreading came at midnight on November 26th, the day before Thanksgiving. He'd been expecting Maggie Stevens to return with legal papers, maybe a court order demanding Justice's immediate surrender. What he hadn't expected was the sound of multiple vehicles pulling up his gravel driveway, engines cutting off in synchronized silence that spoke of coordinated planning. Justice heard them first, his ears pricking forward as he lifted his head from his position beside Billy's recliner. The puppy's body language shifted from relaxed to alert in seconds, muscles tensing as some instinct deeper than training kicked in. Billy reached for his service weapon, a habit 43 years in law enforcement had made automatic, before remembering he was no longer authorized to carry. Through the front window, Billy counted 4 vehicles: Maggie Stevens' official K-9 program SUV, 2 unmarked sedans that screamed federal agents, and Dr. Hawthorne's silver Mercedes gleaming under the porch light like a predator's smile. The message was clear. This wasn't a negotiation anymore. Billy stepped onto his porch with Justice at his side, the puppy pressed against his leg but not cowering. Whatever they'd done to break his spirit hadn't worked completely. There was still fight left in the small black form, still courage waiting to be called upon when the moment demanded it. Maggie Stevens emerged from the lead vehicle, her face pale under the artificial light. Behind her came 2 men in dark suits who moved with the careful precision of people accustomed to violence. Dr. Hawthorne hung back near his Mercedes, nervous energy radiating from him like heat from a fever. "Mr. Cooper?" Maggie began, her voice carrying none of the authority it had held during their previous encounter. "We have a federal warrant for the return of K9089. You need to surrender the animal immediately." Billy studied the warrant she thrust toward him, his eyes catching on details that didn't add up. Federal courts didn't typically involve themselves in local animal control disputes. Federal agents didn't normally accompany veterinarians on routine property recovery missions. And federal warrants didn't usually get issued on Thanksgiving Eve unless someone with serious pull was making phone calls. "Ma'am, this warrant is dated today," Billy observed, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd read thousands of legal documents during his career. "That's awfully fast turnaround for federal paperwork, don't you think?" One of the agents stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his jacket where a shoulder holster would sit. "Mr. Cooper, we're not here to debate legal procedure. We're here to recover stolen government property." Justice growled, the first time Billy had heard the puppy make any aggressive sound. It wasn't the snarl of an attack dog, but the warning of a creature that recognized danger when it appeared in his safe space. Billy's hand dropped to the puppy's head, offering reassurance while his mind raced through options that seemed to narrow with each passing second. "Gentlemen, I'm curious about something," Billy said, his tone conversational despite the tension crackling through the night air. "How exactly does a failed canine puppy merit federal attention? Seems like awfully big guns for such a small target." Dr. Hawthorne shifted nervously, his expensive shoes crunching on gravel as he moved closer to the group. Under the porch light, Billy could see sweat beading on the veterinarian's forehead despite the cool November air. Hawthorne looked like a man who'd gotten in deeper than he'd intended, who'd made compromises that started small and grown into something that threatened to devour him. "The animal represents a significant investment in taxpayer resources," Hawthorne said, his voice pitched too high for genuine authority. Federal oversight of these programs requires proper documentation," Billy interrupted, pulling out his phone with deliberate slowness. "Funny thing about that. I've been doing some research into your documentation practices, Doctor. Amazing what you can find in public records when you know where to look." The change in Hawthorne's expression was immediate and telling. Color drained from his face, leaving him pale as moonlight. His eyes darted between Billy, the agents, and Maggie Stevens with the frantic movement of a trapped animal searching for escape routes. "Mr. Cooper, whatever you think you know," Hawthorne began. "I know 47 dogs have been marked as disposed over the past 3 years," Billy continued, his voice gaining strength as he watched Hawthorne's composure crumble. "I know those disposals generated nearly $2.5 million in budget allocations. And I know Deputy Miguel Martinez was asking questions about those same discrepancies 3 days before someone set him up to be killed." The silence that followed Billy's words was complete, broken only by Justice's steady breathing and the distant sound of night insects. Maggie Stevens's face had gone white, her hands trembling as the implications of Billy's accusations registered. The two agents exchanged glances that spoke of conversations they weren't having in front of witnesses. Dr. Hawthorne broke first, his composure shattering like glass under pressure. "You don't understand the situation, Cooper. This is bigger than one dog, bigger than you can handle. There are people involved who won't hesitate to protect their interests." "People like who, Doctor?" Billy pressed, sensing weakness and exploiting it the way he'd learned to break suspects during 4 decades of interrogations. "People who profit from selling healthy animals to dog-fighting rings? People who murder federal officers to protect their operation? Miguel Martinez's death was an accident." Hawthorne's voice cracked as the words tumbled out. "He wasn't supposed to be in that house. The intelligence was wrong, the timing was off." "Shut up, Richard," one of the agents snapped, his hand moving inside his jacket with professional smoothness. "You're saying too much." But Hawthorne was past caring about operational security, past caring about anything except the crushing weight of guilt that had been eating him alive for 6 months. He was going to expose everything, the financial arrangements, the disposal protocols, the whole network. We couldn't let him destroy something that had taken years to build. Billy felt pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. Miguel Martinez hadn't died in a random drug raid. He'd been murdered to protect a conspiracy that reached far beyond animal abuse. The intelligence that put him in that house hadn't been wrong. It had been deliberately falsified. Someone had wanted Deputy Martinez dead, and they'd used the war on drugs as cover for assassination. Justice pressed closer against Billy's leg, sensing the tension radiating from his human. The puppy's presence reminded Billy of what was at stake here. Not just Justice's life, but the principle that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the personal cost. "Maggie," Billy said quietly, his eyes never leaving the two agents who were moving to flank him, "tell me you're not part of this. Tell me you didn't know what was happening to those dogs." Maggie Stevens looked like a woman watching her world collapse in real time. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "Billy, I swear I didn't know about Miguel. I thought we were just streamlining the disposal process, making the system more efficient." More profitable, you mean? Billy corrected. For who, Maggie? Who's been collecting the money? The agent who'd been moving to Billy's left stopped his advance, his hand now clearly visible inside his jacket. Mr. Cooper, you need to surrender the animal and stop asking questions that don't concern you. Billy looked down at Justice, who was trembling against his leg but standing his ground. The puppy had survived months of abuse, systematic trauma designed to break his spirit and make him disposable. But he was still here, still fighting, still trusting in the man who'd pulled him from that medical waste container. "You know what, boys?" Billy said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd made peace with whatever came next. "I don't think I'm going to do that." What happened next unfolded with the terrible inevitability of a nightmare. The agent to Billy's left drew his weapon with practiced smoothness, the metallic click of the safety being disengaged cutting through the night air like a blade. Justice whimpered and pressed harder against Billy's leg, his small body trembling with fear that no 5-month-old puppy should ever have to experience. "Mr. Cooper, step away from the animal," the agent commanded, his voice flat and professional. "This doesn't have to escalate." But Billy had seen enough escalation in 43 years to recognize when a situation had already passed the point of peaceful resolution. These men hadn't come to negotiate or serve warrants. They'd come to eliminate evidence and silence witnesses, the same way they'd silenced Miguel Martinez 6 months ago. "You killed a good man," Billy said quietly, his hand resting protectively on Justice's head. Miguel had a wife, 2 little girls. He was trying to do the right thing. Martinez was interfering with a federal operation, the second agent replied, positioning himself to Billy's right. Sometimes collateral damage is unavoidable. The casual dismissal of Miguel's life, reducing a decorated officer to collateral damage, ignited something primal in Billy's chest. 43 years of sworn service, of protecting and serving, of believing that the badge meant something more than just metal and authority. They were talking about murdering a federal officer like it was a routine business decision. That's when Justice did something that changed everything. The puppy stepped forward, placing himself between Billy and the agents, his small body rigid with determination. A growl rumbled deep in his chest. Not the fear-based aggression they'd noted in his file, but the protective instinct of a creature defending his pack. In that moment, Justice proved what Billy had known all along. He wasn't a failed K9, he was a dog with the heart of a guardian who'd been broken by systematic abuse. "He's not aggressive," Billy said, his voice thick with emotion as he watched Justice stand his ground against armed men. "He's protective. There's a difference you bastards never understood." Dr. Hawthorne was backing toward his Mercedes, his face pale with terror as the situation spiraled beyond his control. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he mumbled, his words slurring with panic. "We were just supposed to get the dog back, maintain the cover story. Nobody said anything about..." "About what, Richard?" Maggie Stevens stepped forward, her own weapon drawn but pointed at the ground. "About murdering a retired deputy and his dog to protect your gambling debts. About covering up the systematic torture and sale of federal animals." Billy felt the world tilt as he realized Maggie wasn't with the agents. She was against them. Her gun wasn't aimed at Billy. It was trained on the men who'd come to eliminate witnesses to their conspiracy. "Agent Stevens, lower your weapon," the first gunman commanded. "You're interfering with a federal operation." "I'm not Agent Stevens anymore," Maggie replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I'm FBI Agent Margaret Stevens, and you're all under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and the murder of Deputy Miguel Martinez." The revelation hit Billy like a physical blow. Maggie hadn't been running the K9 program corruption, she'd been investigating it. Her harsh treatment of Justice, her demands for his return, her apparent cooperation with Hawthorne's network, all of it had been part of an undercover operation to expose the conspiracy from within. The Bureau has been investigating this network for 8 months, Maggie continued, her weapon steady as she covered both agents. Ever since Deputy Martinez contacted us with evidence of systematic fraud. We were close to making arrests when Miguel was killed. That's when we knew this went deeper than financial crimes. Dr. Hawthorne broke for his car, his expensive shoes slipping on gravel as panic overrode rational thought. He made it 3 steps before Jake Cooper emerged from the darkness behind the house, tackling the veterinarian with the solid impact of a man who'd spent his youth playing high school football. "Sorry I'm late, Uncle Billy," Jake called out as he zip-tied Hawthorne's hands behind his back. "Had to make sure the FBI backup units were in position before the party started." Billy felt his knees buckle as the adrenaline that had sustained him through the confrontation finally gave way to exhaustion. Justice immediately pressed against him, offering what comfort a small dog could provide to a man whose world had just been turned upside down. The next few minutes blurred together in a chaos of sirens, flashing lights, and federal agents reading rights to men who'd thought themselves above the law. Billy sat on his porch steps with Justice curled in his lap, watching his driveway fill with law enforcement vehicles and crime scene techs. But even as Justice was finally being served, Billy felt something breaking inside his chest. The stress of the past 2 weeks, the confrontation, the revelation that he'd been unknowingly part of an FBI operation, it all crashed down on him at once like a dam bursting under too much pressure. That's when the pain hit, sharp, crushing agony that spread from his chest down his left arm, stealing his breath and blurring his vision. Billy gasped, his hand clutching at his shirt as the world began to spin around him. Justice barked once, sharp and urgent, then began howling with a sound that carried every ounce of grief and terror a small dog could express. The last thing Billy remembered before darkness claimed him was Justice's warm body pressed against his face, offering comfort even as his human collapsed toward the edge of everything they'd fought so hard to protect. The reversal began with a handwritten letter that Jake found tucked inside Billy's wallet while sorting through personal effects at the hospital. Betty's careful script covered 3 pages of lavender stationery, the kind she'd used for thank-you notes and sympathy cards throughout their marriage. The date in the corner made Billy's heart skip, March 15th, 2020, 2 weeks before she died. "My dearest Billy," the letter began, and Jake's voice cracked as he read aloud in the sterile hospital room where his uncle lay connected to monitors that beeped with mechanical precision. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you're probably blaming yourself for not saving me. Stop it. Some battles can't be won with stubbornness and determination, though Lord knows you tried." Justice lay curled on the hospital bed beside Billy, a special therapy dog exception that Dr. Morrison had granted after witnessing the puppy's distress when separated from his human. The nurses had initially protested, citing regulations and liability concerns, until they saw how Billy's vital signs stabilized whenever Justice was near. "I know you, Billy Cooper," Jake continued reading, his voice growing stronger as Betty's words worked their magic. "I know you'll try to disappear into that ranch and let grief eat you alive. That's why I've made arrangements you're not going to like." Billy's eyes fluttered open for the first time in 36 hours, focusing on Jake's face with the confused disorientation of someone surfacing from deep water. His first word was barely a whisper. "Justice?" "Right here, Uncle Billy," Jake assured him, gesturing to the black puppy who immediately perked up at the sound of Billy's voice. "He hasn't left your side. The doctors say he probably saved your life." His howling brought the paramedics running. As Billy's strength returned over the following days, Jake finished reading Betty's letter, each revelation reshaping their understanding of recent events. Betty had contacted Agent Maggie Stevens months before her death, expressing concern about Billy's deepening depression and social isolation. She'd specifically requested that when the K-9 investigation reached a critical point, they find a way to involve Billy, not as a target but as someone whose expertise and moral compass could help expose the truth. "I arranged for a dog to need you, Billy," Betty had written. "His name will be Justice, and he'll be broken in ways that match your own heart. You'll save each other, just like we did all those years ago when you were young, and I was foolish enough to think I could fix a stubborn cowboy with nothing but love." The conspiracy's full scope emerged during the trials that followed. Dr. Hawthorne's gambling debts had made him vulnerable to recruitment by a network that spanned 6 states, selling failed canines to dogfighting rings and exotic animal collectors. The operation had generated over $4 million in 3 years, with corrupt officials taking 30% cuts while healthy animals suffered abuse designed to make them appear unsuitable for service. Miguel Martinez had discovered the scheme through financial discrepancies in his department's canine budget. His careful documentation had provided the FBI with evidence of systematic fraud, but his investigation had been compromised by a mole within the federal system. The drug raid that killed him hadn't been random. It had been orchestrated to eliminate the one honest cop who posed a threat to their operation. Commissioner Drake Wilson, it turned out, had been the network's primary facilitator in Kendall County, using his political connections to smooth regulatory oversight and redirect budget allocations. His passionate speeches about fiscal responsibility had been covers for embezzlement schemes that lined his pockets while taxpayers funded the abuse of animals they believed were being protected. Justice's own story proved the most heartbreaking. He'd been deliberately traumatized to create the aggressive behaviors noted in his file, subjected to months of systematic abuse designed to make him appear dangerous and unsuitable for law enforcement work. The injection sites Dr. Mitchell had found weren't from medical treatment. They were from sedatives used to keep him manageable during transport to potential buyers. But Justice had been saved by his own resilience and the FBI's timeline. Agent Stevens had been tracking the network's operations, waiting for the right moment to move without alerting other cells in different states. Billy's rescue of Justice had accelerated their plans, forcing them to act before the investigation was complete. "Your uncle saved more than one dog," Agent Stevens explained to Jake during one of her hospital visits. His actions exposed a network that was operating in Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, New Mexico, and Arizona. "We've made 47 arrests and recovered over 100 animals that were supposed to be dead." The most stunning revelation came when they discovered Betty's own involvement ran deeper than anyone had imagined. Her cousin worked for the FBI's Financial Crimes Division and had been instrumental in connecting the dots between canine program irregularities and Miguel Martinez's murder. Betty had used her final months to help build the case that would eventually bring justice to her husband and the animals being systematically abused. "She knew you'd need a reason to keep living," Agent Stevens told Billy as he prepared for discharge, "and she knew Justice would need someone who understood what it meant to survive trauma and find purpose again." Rosa Martinez visited on Billy's last day in the hospital, bringing Miguel's service medal and a photograph of him with his canine partner Bruno. The picture showed a young deputy grinning beside a German shepherd whose eyes held the same intelligence and loyalty that Billy saw in Justice every day. "Miguel would want Justice to have this," Rosa said, pinning the medal to Justice's collar with hands that no longer trembled when she spoke her husband's name. "He believed every animal deserved a chance to prove their worth." Looks like Justice found the right person to help him do that. As Billy sat in the hospital bed with Justice curled beside him, reading Betty's letter for the 3rd time, he finally understood the gift his wife had given him. Not just a dog to care for, but a purpose that honored everything they'd believed in together: protection of the innocent, justice for the wronged, and the unwavering faith that love could triumph over even the darkest corruption. "Thank you, Betty," he whispered to the empty air, his hand resting on Justice's head as the puppy slept peacefully for the first time since Billy had found him. "I understand now." Outside the hospital window, the Texas sun was setting over hills that had sheltered 4 generations of Cooper men. Tomorrow, Billy would take Justice home to a ranch that no longer felt empty, to a life that finally had purpose again. The worst was over. The healing could begin. Christmas Eve arrived with the kind of Texas winter that made natives grateful and transplants confused. 58 degrees with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of cedar and possibility. Billy sat on his porch watching Justice play with 3 other rescued German shepherds in the fenced yard that had been expanded twice since November. Each dog carried scars from their past, but in the golden afternoon light, they looked like what they were: survivors who'd found their way home. Jake's family had moved into the ranch house permanently after Thanksgiving, transforming empty rooms into spaces filled with laughter and the chaos of new life. Sarah had delivered baby Elizabeth, Betty, to everyone who mattered, on December 15th, and the infant's cries now mixed with Justice's contented sighs to create a symphony Billy had thought he'd never hear again. "Granddad Billy," 3-year-old Emma called from the yard, her pronunciation still wrestling with complicated consonants. "Justice found something." Billy watched as the black German shepherd carefully carried a tennis ball to the toddler, his movements gentle despite his size. At 8 months old, Justice had grown into his promise, 90 pounds of muscle and intelligence wrapped around a heart that seemed incapable of holding grudges. The trauma that had marked his early months remained, visible in his startled reactions to sudden noises and his need to check on his humans throughout the day, but it no longer defined him. The Cooper's Second Chance Ranch sign by the front gate had been up for 2 weeks, marking the official launch of Billy's nonprofit organization for rehabilitating failed service animals. The GoFundMe campaign had raised over $200,000, enough to renovate the barn into proper kennels and hire Dr. Sarah Mitchell as the ranch's veterinarian consultant. More importantly, it had given Billy something he'd lost after Betty's death: a reason to wake up every morning with purpose burning in his chest. The trials had concluded 3 weeks ago with sentences that satisfied Billy's sense of justice, if not his thirst for revenge. Dr. Hawthorne received 15 years for conspiracy and animal cruelty, his veterinary license permanently revoked. Commissioner Wilson got 12 years for fraud and corruption, his political career ending in handcuffs and headlines that would follow him long after his release. The federal agents received life sentences for Miguel Martinez's murder, their betrayal of their oath adding weight to their punishment. Agent Maggie Stevens had been quietly transferred to the FBI's Animal Cruelty Task Force, her undercover work earning commendations that couldn't be publicized without compromising ongoing investigations. She visited the ranch monthly, ostensibly to check on Justice's progress, but really to find peace in watching the puppy she'd helped save thrive in ways the system had never allowed. "Billy?" Jake called from the kitchen doorway. "Mom's on the phone. She wants to talk to you about Christmas dinner." Billy's sister lived in Dallas now, but family bonds had strengthened since the media attention surrounding Justice's story. The book deal had been finalized last week. Justice and Faith, a story of survival and second chances, with proceeds designated for the ranch's expansion. Speaking engagements were booked through the following summer, taking Billy and Justice to conferences where their story could inspire other communities to examine their own animal welfare programs. Inside the house, baby Betty slept in the bassinet that had once held Michael 35 years ago, her tiny fist curled around the corner of a blanket Betty Sr. had crocheted during her final months. The circle of life completing itself in ways that defied explanation but demanded gratitude. Justice followed Billy inside, settling beside the Christmas tree where presents waited for tomorrow's celebration. The puppy's favorite spot was near the mantel where Michael's flag still sat folded in military precision, as if he understood the weight of sacrifice that permeated the Cooper family history. The phone call with Billy's sister stretched into an hour of planning and reminiscing, family connections that had frayed during the darkest period of Billy's grief, now stronger than they'd been in decades. Justice's story had reminded everyone that love multiplied when shared, that healing happened faster when burdens were distributed among people who cared. As evening approached, Billy found himself in Betty's garden, now restored to its former glory by Sarah's green thumb and Jake's manual labor. The roses were dormant for winter, but the herb garden continued producing rosemary and sage that flavored family dinners and filled the house with scents that spoke of home and continuity. "You did good, Betty," Billy said to the gathering darkness, his words carrying on the breeze that rustled through cedar branches. "Justice isn't just healing, he's helping heal others, just like you planned." The ranch now housed 12 rescued animals, each with their own story of trauma and recovery. Kaiser, a German shepherd who'd been abandoned after failing protection training, now served as a therapy dog for veterans with PTSD. Luna, a Belgian Malinois marked for disposal due to hip dysplasia, had found new purpose as a companion for disabled children. Every animal proved what Billy had always believed: failure was often just potential waiting for the right opportunity to bloom. Tomorrow's Christmas service at First Baptist would feature Justice as part of the Nativity presentation, his calm presence helping anxious children overcome their fear of animals. Pastor Williams had called it witnessing through action, and Billy couldn't argue with theology that put love ahead of doctrine. The book's dedication was simple: to Betty, who taught me that love transcends death, and to Justice, who taught me that second chances can save 2 lives at once. The first chapter opened with Billy finding Justice in that medical waste container, but the real story was about what happened after, how a broken man and a traumatized puppy had healed each other through the simple act of refusing to give up. As Christmas Eve darkness settled over the ranch, Billy sat in his recliner with Justice at his feet and baby Betty sleeping in his arms. Jake and Sarah were in the kitchen preparing tomorrow's feast, their voices mixing with Christmas music that filled spaces that had been silent for too long. Justice raised his head as car lights turned into the driveway, his tail wagging as he recognized the engine sound. Rosa Martinez emerged from her vehicle carrying a covered dish and a wrapped present, her monthly visit timed perfectly for the holiday gathering. Her children tumbled out behind her, excited to play with the puppies and hear Uncle Billy's stories about their father's courage. "Miguel would love seeing this," Rosa said, settling beside Billy as the children ran toward the yard where the dogs waited with patient enthusiasm. All these animals getting second chances, all these families coming together. He always said good things happened when good people refused to quit. Billy watched Justice supervise the children's play, the dog's protective instincts balanced by his gentle nature. In 8 months, the puppy had transformed from a broken victim to a confident guardian, proof that healing was possible when love was combined with patience and purpose. The Christmas Eve stars emerged one by one over the Texas hill country, their light reflecting on a ranch that hummed with life and possibility. 4 generations of Coopers under one roof, a dozen rescued animals finding their purpose, and a legacy that would continue long after Billy's own story ended. Betty's coffee mug sat on the side table, no longer a symbol of loss but a reminder that love continued in new forms. Billy had learned to make 1 cup for drinking and 1 for remembering, honoring the past while embracing the future that stretched before them like an answered prayer. Justice sighed contentedly at Billy's feet, his breathing steady and peaceful as Christmas Eve settled around the ranch like a blessing. Tomorrow would bring celebration, but tonight was for gratitude, for second chances, for family bonds that survived loss, and for the miraculous way that saving 1 small life could transform an entire world. The healing was complete. The new chapter had begun. Sometimes life breaks us so completely that we forget we're worth saving. Billy Cooper thought his story ended when he buried his wife and son. A 67-year-old man with arthritic hands and a heart full of silence, wondering if God had forgotten his address. But in a medical waste container behind a canine facility, he found justice. A German shepherd puppy thrown away like garbage, marked as failed by people who'd never learned the difference between broken and healing. What Billy discovered wasn't just animal cruelty worth fighting against, but proof that second chances can save two lives at once. When justice pressed against Billy's leg during their darkest hour, when corruption threatened to destroy them both, something miraculous happened. A retired deputy found his purpose again, and a traumatized puppy learned to trust. Today, Cooper's Second Chance Ranch houses 12 rescued animals and 4 generations of family under one roof. Billy's arthritic hands now build kennels instead of dwelling on loss, and Justice's gentle strength helps other wounded souls find their way home. Betty's love transcended death through careful planning, proving that some angels work in advance, orchestrating miracles disguised as rescue missions. Questions for reflection. Have you ever found unexpected purpose in your retirement years? What failed dream in your life might actually be waiting for the right moment to succeed? Share your story in the comments below. We believe every second chance deserves to be celebrated.